From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Today we focus on the latest situation in Ukraine as Russia announces a partial troops withdrawal from the Russia-Ukraine border. Much of the West remains wary and cynical. Some leaders in Western capitals still see wars as possible, if not imminent. This may sound all too familiar for those who've been following the geopoliticking between the US, NATO, and Russia over the decades. Moscow has been demanding a new treaty to address its concerns with NATO's never-ending eastward expansion. But Washington and Brussels claim that Russia must stop its, quote, hostility and interventionist policies first. Where are the current tensions headed? For some insight today, we're very pleased to be joined by Peter Zalmayev in Kiev, Ukraine. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. We also have with us today from Washington, D.C., William Courtney, adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. Ambassador Courtney was the special assistant to former U.S. President Bill Clinton for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And last but certainly not least, we're joined by Martin Sieff, senior fellow of American University in Moscow, known as AUM. Gentlemen, welcome to this program. It is quickly becoming a war of words, a war of information, a war of narratives, like it or not. Russia's military announces a partial troops withdrawal, even showing videos of its doing so. But NATO and much of the Western media remains skeptical, taking the Russian narrative with a pinch of salt, if you like, with NATO's chief saying that they're still seeing a military buildup around the Russia-Ukraine border. Ambassador Courtney, who should we believe?
Well, the United States and NATO allies have been quite open since the crisis began, revealing information that normally would be classified, would be kept secret. But the purpose of the NATO countries has been to alert publics and help prepare them for the risks ahead. The evidence now, just today, the West is announcing that there's 7,000 more Russian troops around Ukraine. So the buildup is continuing.
Is that information from the Western intelligence apparatus?
It's from the West.
Okay. To what extent do you think we should give credit to that piece of information? Because, we're reminded of, like it or not, weapons of mass destruction, and the Kabul, not going to fall, right?
Yes, in this case, though, much information has been available. It's been on social media, on the internet. There have been pictures. There are social media postings by Russians themselves that have been made available. So the evidence is pretty clear.
All right. Peter, you're on the ground in Kiev, Ukraine. Give us a sense of how you make sense of all these competing narratives.
Well, yes, I agree with the previous speaker that it's been America's strategy all along to try to prevent Russia from aggressive actions against Ukraine, from a full country invasion, which the West is claiming Russia is capable of doing. The Ukrainian side has been kind of in conflict with the Biden administration regarding its assessment of what Russia's plans are. The Ukrainians still, they're wary, obviously. There was a day of unity here yesterday that was designed to sort of, prevent from contemplating an invasion and to show Russia resolve by the Ukrainian people. But once again, Ukrainian intelligence services, the Ukrainian president keep insisting that Russia, first of all, is not capable of a full country invasion, and also that it probably has not entered its plans. There are other ways that Russia can try to create panic and instability here in Ukraine, which is a plausible case to be made. That's what it's trying to do. There was a cyber attack on its government services websites and its major banks just 2 days ago. And the Russian parliament voted to recognize the splinter so-called republics of Luhansk and Donetsk in the east of the country. So the assessment remains that no full country invasion, but Ukrainians are very wary that a limited action and continuing cyber and other sort of malicious kind of activities will continue for the foreseeable future.
Martin, let me go to you. I mean, it is rare, if not non-existent, in major Western news to hear from, to hear a Russian perspective, right? Except that when you read RT, when you watch RT, or listen to Sputnik. Tell us what you think about the situation.
I think there is a real danger of conflict coming, but for opposite reasons. If one looks at what President Putin has very clearly said, and what Foreign Minister Lavrov have very clearly expressed recently, the Russian position is hardening. They are not becoming more aggressive, but the point you made before, I think, is exactly the right one. For 30 years, the United States and NATO have ignored all the solemn commitments and agreements they made to both the Soviet Union and Russia at the end of the Cold War. NATO, at the end of the Cold War, had its border on the river Elbe in the middle of Germany. Then Germany was united. Then, against every pledge that two United States presidents, Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, made, all the eastern countries of the former Warsaw Pact were incorporated into NATO. This was totally unnecessary. The great George Kennan, arguably one of the wisest figures in American foreign policy in the last century, said it was the mistake of a lifetime. It was putting the United States onto a disastrous collision course with Russia. Kennan repeatedly warned against this. Not satisfied with this, President George W. Bush, the second President Bush, then brought three former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and
the Baltic
Lithuania,
countries,
into NATO.
the three Baltic countries near Germany.
Exactly. And now we find Ukraine, which was an integral part of Russia for a third of a millennium, for more than 300 years, and whose independence Russia has never threatened. Russia has never threatened the independence of Ukraine over the past 30 years. But there was a coup in Ukraine backed by the United States in 2014, a violent, murderous coup that toppled a democratically elected government. And since then, modern neo-Nazis, backed incredibly by the United States, have played a significant role in confronting and threatening the Russian secessionist provinces, largely Russian-speaking and looking to Russia for protection in the east of Ukraine. So it is perfectly feasible, I think, that Russia may now move to follow up its recognition of those two provinces by sending the Russian army in to protect those provinces. And they would, if the Ukrainians, backed by the US, move against them, Russia may well respond. So the danger of escalation is still there, but Russia is certainly not looking to conquer Ukraine. They have no interest in doing this.
Oh, Ambassador Courtney, do you want to respond to what Martin just said? Yes, Martin. Thanks for your perspectives. But Ambassador Courtney, do you want to respond?
Well, let me just note that the array of forces around Ukraine, including in Crimea and more recently in Belarus, suggests an offensive posture. The West is seeing that some of the forces are dispersing to field locations, which is the kind of measure you would take prior to launching military action. Russian forces in Belarus appear postured to move south on both sides of the Dnipro River in order to encircle and seize Kiev. It is quite clear that the large Russian forces to the east of Ukraine and in Crimea are also offensively postured. So the West does not know what the Kremlin is going to do. Kremlin could pull back and retreat, as have been some indications, or it could move ahead, as we're seeing now with the greater increase of Russian forces around Ukraine. So it's not clear what's going to happen, but the capability of a massive invasion is there, and we have not seen that in Russian military exercises to this extent before.
Peter, Ambassador Courtney talked about, an offensive posture by Moscow. Do Ukrainians and, for that matter, Belarusians perhaps look at that way?
Well, yes, obviously, and the Ukrainian government a few days ago, actually, under the Vienna document, Vienna Convention, sent an ultimatum to Russia in response to Russia's ultimatum to NATO, demanding within 48 hours to hear back from Russia what the intentions are. There is a legal mechanism for that. Russia ignored it, referring to its troop withdrawal, which the West is now disputing. Well, we are sort of at loggerheads now, and you mentioned Belarus. That's another very important component if we are trying to unpack Vladimir Putin's intentions, what the new status quo in his mind should be in Europe. That it's possible that he will just keep the 30,000 troops currently stationed in Belarus permanently there, effectively sealing the military occupation of Belarus, making it a protectorate. And there's also a case to be made that by doing this, by moving the goalposts so far, by ratcheting up all this pressure on Ukraine, and then just walking away, the world, the West, will just sort of sigh in relief and say, well, good, and then forgive Putin the essential, occupation of an independent country such as Belarus. That's what Putin's tactics have been all along. He annexes Crimea, then he starts a war in eastern Ukraine. Well, the West wants him to stop the war in eastern Ukraine. He stops the war, all of a sudden, Crimea, okay, well, let's just live with this. He wants to create new sort of standards of normalcy, and is constantly trying and probing what is possible and what will be tolerated. And let me just, if you allow me, just referring to the speaker in Moscow, we'll just have to take issue with his characterization so that our listeners and viewers have an alternative view. I mean, I'm based here in Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian, Russian-speaking Ukrainian, originally from Donetsk. When he talks about our colleague in Moscow, talks about neo-Nazis and the bloody coup and that Russia never threatened Ukraine in the last 30 years, well, 2014, Russia invaded Crimea and started a war in eastern Ukraine. Obviously, that was a gross violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, and there's no neo-Nazis in Russia. In Ukraine. Ukraine is much more tolerant of dissent, including political dissent. It doesn't throw its opposition in jail like Russia does, and there's no persecution of Russian speakers. You come out on the streets of Kiev, everyone speaks Ukrainian, Russian, they mix and match. There's simply no problem. So I just really, really take issue with his characterization.
Martin, do you want to respond?
Yes, certainly. I think our colleague is very disingenuous. First of all, the Russian government has offered the United States compromise terms to guarantee the full independence of Ukraine. All Russia is looking for is a guarantee from the United States and from Ukraine that Ukraine will not seek and will not be accepted as a member of NATO, because that will pose a very immediate and ongoing increasing threat to Russia. Secondly, Belarus is not under threat from Russia. The government of Belarus has faced destabilizing threats, which it assesses as coming from the West. Thirdly, as to the people in Crimea, the people in Crimea are overwhelmingly ethnic Russian. The successive Ukrainian governments refuse to grant plebiscites or referendums for the people of Crimea to choose whether they wanted to be in Russia or Ukraine for 30 years, because they knew what the result would be, that there would be an overwhelming vote by 70 or 80% at least, if not higher, to join Russia. There was never any permission given to the people of Crimea to vote for their own fate. They had never chosen to be in Ukraine in the first place. Ironically, it was a Ukrainian leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who quite arbitrarily shifted Crimea from the Russian SFSR, Russian Socialist Federal Republic, in 1954 to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic within the Soviet Union. So these are very disingenuous points. Russia has made very clear repeatedly it envisages relations with an independent Ukraine the way Canada has close relations with the United States. Nobody doubts Canada is an independent, distinct nation from the United States, but the United States also takes for granted that Canada is will not threaten the United States and is a loyal ally. Putin is not even looking for Ukraine to be a loyal ally to Russia. He is looking for Ukraine to be neutral and not to join NATO. And again, the commitment not to expand NATO uncontrollably eastward was made by President Ronald Reagan, was made by President George Herbert Walker Bush, and has been systematically broken by every United States president since then, with the possible exception of Donald Trump. And the onward thrust of the United States and NATO eastwards continues to this day and is unnecessary. An independent relationship with the European Union would be quite sufficient. There is no need even for Poland and these countries to be in NATO. Far from improving their security, it is threatening their security because it is threatening a major war in Europe.
Right.
The more insecure the Russians feel from experience, the more likely they are to react against it. And this is the central issue.
Oh, okay, Martin. Peter, can you respond quickly before I go to Ambassador Courtney?
Yeah. Very, very quickly, 2 points. As far as the fact of Crimea being Ukrainian, well, okay. Be it as it may, whatever Khrushchev did, it was a fact on the ground. And the 1994 Budapest Memorandum guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in exchange of nuclear weapons, which it turned over to Russia. Russia is the guarantor of Ukrainian sovereignty, which it later, in 2014, violated by taking over, Crimea. That's very important. And the other issue that our speaker referred to is, the NATO issue. Obviously, if Vladimir Putin did not increase instability and did not make Ukrainians feel insecure, there would not have been this talk about NATO. So his policies and his actions have had the opposite effect of what he achieved by making Ukrainians feel insecure and wanting to join NATO as a bulwark against Putin.
Well, you can argue this is the chicken egg problem. Ambassador Courtney in Washington, D.C., Russian President Vladimir Putin has over and over again demanded that NATO not accept Ukraine as a new member. And in fact, if you look at the past decades, NATO has been, ever expanding. It went from a transatlantic military bloc to, a military bloc plus Baltic countries, and now plus most countries in the Balkans, as well as many Central European countries. Is there some legitimacy in Russia's concern?
Russia is concerned because it alleges that NATO is an offensive organization. It's not. NATO is a defensive alliance. The countries around Russia that have joined NATO, the Baltics, the former East European countries, they've done this because they're concerned about their own security and particularly now concerned about Russian imperial ambitions against them. The big problem in this current crisis is that Russia has made amateurish, outlandish demands for security guarantees, for NATO to move all of its infrastructure back to before the expansion began, knowing that there's no possibility NATO would agree to any of this. And NATO and the U.S. have not agreed to any of it. The President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, they know how to do professional diplomacy. The new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the Iran nuclear agreement are examples of high-quality Russian diplomacy. But in this case, this amateurish effort suggests something completely different. It's not clear where this is coming from. Is this a hardline group in the Kremlin that is proposing this? But what Russia has proposed is something that it knows it's not going to get. And so now it's out on the edge. It's taken Russia out on the limb. Russia has come to the point now where there's really not much room for diplomacy because Russia's demanding so much that can't be accepted. So Russia really will have to make a decision whether to pull back its forces or go in. And this is a very dangerous moment. It didn't have to occur.
Well, Ambassador Courtney, what do you think President Joe Biden will do? Because judging from his Tuesday address to the world, he struck a somewhat conciliatory tone. He said the U.S. is proposing new arms control measures, new transparency measures, new strategic stability measures. What do you think those measures could be?
Well, those measures, confidence-building measures, transparency measures, those arise out of earlier agreements, including the Vienna document, which our colleague in Kiev referred to, and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Those kinds of agreements could have been achieved without any of this crisis behavior by Russia. President Biden has tried to be conciliatory, but on the main issues, he has made no concessions, NATO has made no concessions, and Ukraine has made no concessions. So this has put the Kremlin in a bind. They've asked for something that is impossible to get. So this is a little bit like Nikita Khrushchev in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev took Russia out on a limb and ended up retreating. It's not clear what the Kremlin is going to do this time, but there is precedent.
Well, Martin, how do you like this analogy with the Cuban Missile Crisis? And is Russia demanding too much this time around?
I think the analogy with the Cuban Missile Crisis exists, but it is exactly the opposite of what Ambassador Courtney said, and surely he is aware of this. Khrushchev took an enormous aggressive risk by putting nuclear-capable missiles that could hit 150 cities across the eastern and central United States in Cuba. He brought Russian military strategic strength to the Western Hemisphere. Here, it is NATO that is providing lethal weapons in Ukraine, a country that was part of Russia, a country that was invaded and occupied by hostile Western genocidal armies in 1812, during World War I, and worst of all by the Nazis in World War II. And it is NATO and the United States that are putting the pressure on Ukraine here. And sure enough, leaders in Ukraine would like to have their cake and eat it, but they're playing an extremely risky and difficult game. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev brought Russian strategic nuclear threats to the Western Hemisphere, to within 100 miles of the United States in Florida. Here we have the United States and NATO expanding, again breaking these most solemn commitments that were made by two United States presidents in the 1980s and 1990s to the leaders of the Soviet Union and to the first democratic leader of Russia, if you can call him that, President Boris Yeltsin, in 1989, 1990, 1991, and 92. So there is a parallel here, but the parallel is Joe Biden is now the risk taker that Nikita Khrushchev was, and not all the sophistry or hair splitting can change this basic fact. And also I find it ridiculous that our Ukrainian interlocutor can talk so glibly about democratic rights, but he ignores the democratic rights of the people in Crimea who, as I say, were not allowed over a period of more than 30 years to decide whether they wanted to be in Ukraine or Russia, whatever was signed in Budapest or not. And NATO's peaceful record is not peaceful. The people of Yugoslavia, of Syria, of Afghanistan, of Iraq have been bombed flat, and of Syria have been bombed flat out by NATO, either by NATO forces or by forces of NATO nations at the behest of the United States or by the United States itself. Our record has been very dubious, in fact, alarming and unpredictable over the last 25 years and more.
Peter,
and this does not, all this can do is generate more fear and uncertainty and provoke a more dangerous and unpredictable reaction from other nations such as Russia.
Peter, I will go to you shortly, but before I do, I want to invite Ambassador Courtney to comment quickly. Ambassador Courtney, isn't there some truth to what Martin Sieff just said? I mean, ostensibly, Washington said it took no position regarding the future of Ukraine, but on the ground, we do remember many years ago when Victoria Nuland and late Senator John McCain speaking on the street of Kiev on Madame Square, you know, encouraging one side, or rather, if not inciting one side to go against the other. What do you make of all that?
Democratic popular uprisings, Orange Revolution, then the Maidan Square. So the United States and Europe, we've always been sympathetic to democratic efforts in countries to become more democratic. The efforts by Russia, particularly the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, seizing and annexing Crimea, starting the war in eastern Ukraine, This came not because of NATO activities. In fact, Ukraine wasn't planning to go into NATO. It wasn't planning to join the European Union. It was just going to sign an association agreement with the European Union. So this suggests that Russia's aim is not really to stop Ukraine from going to the West, from going to NATO. It is to stop Ukraine from going to the West altogether and leaving the Russian sphere of influence. What the Kremlin really wants is to have the West recognize a coercive sphere of influence that allows Russia to use force at will in any of its neighboring countries. And this is something the West strongly opposes.
Peter, give us a sense of the dynamics on the ground in Ukraine. What do the people of Ukraine want about its future, be it whether or not it wants to join NATO or its association proximity to Moscow?
Well, I would probably go out on a limb and say that Ukrainians don't mind having normal and good relations with Russia, but they're very skeptical that this is going to happen under Vladimir Putin's reign. They do not believe in a word he says. They do not believe his intentions are good for Ukraine. They believe that for as long as Putin is around, at least, he will want to keep Ukraine on a short leash and away from moving closer towards Western civilization. Let's put it this way. Ukrainians have made a choice. They made a choice in 2014 to make a final break with the so-called Russian world. I'm not saying that this is a policy that every Ukrainian supports, but obviously, like I said, with Putin's successive aggression actions against Ukraine, he himself has pushed Ukraine further and further away from Russia's sphere of influence. So Ukrainians want to live in peace. They want to be a part of the European community, and they want to have a rule of law, democracy, and human rights.
All right. On Tuesday, the State Duma of Russia voted to ask President Vladimir Putin to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, two Russian-influenced regions in Donbas region. You know this very well, Peter. Do you think President Putin may go ahead and give a green light? What would happen if he did?
Well, that's a very good question. He has just given himself an added, tool of pressure against Ukraine. Having these republics in this kind of limbo with undetermined status has been actually helpful to Russia. They are using them as a sort of cudgel, as a way to continue to pressure the West into making concessions and to try to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence. By putting them back, forcing them back into Ukraine's body politic, into the government, and into the parliament as an autonomous entity. It will serve as a block on Ukraine's European Union integration and integration into NATO. So it seems to me that this is continuing brinksmanship on the part of Vladimir Putin, maybe a safe-facing measure to say, well, we may not be attacking Ukraine now, but look what we're doing. We're protecting the Russian speakers, even though, once again, they do not need protections. There have been no facts of genocide like we saw in Yugoslavia, which our Moscow colleague referred to. Name one such event in Ukraine's post-Soviet history. It never happened. So I think it's in Vladimir Putin's interest to keep them in this kind of status quo in limbo. It will be much more useful than just recognizing them outright.
Well, listen, gentlemen, thanks a lot. We learned a lot from the perspectives of Ukraine, America, and as well as Russia and Europe. Thanks so much, Martin Sieff, Ambassador Courtney, and Peter. Thank you for doing this, and come back again soon to The Hub on CGTN. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. I'll see you again soon.